Good morning. I'm joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area. I am an urban IPM advisor for the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. It's 7:30 in the morning here. I got my coffee. We were setting up this morning and John, our MC, felt a little shaking there in Philadelphia. Turns out maybe it was a little earthquake that you guys had. So around here, in the Bay Area, we call those reminders. It's a reminder that the earth is moving under our feet. But anyway, thanks for joining me this morning. I'm going to try my best to introduce you to the history of IPM, Integrated Pest Management, and it's largely an agricultural history, but then we'll talk about how we can apply those themes, those central tenets to urban pest control. So if you guys want to learn more about my program, I invite you to visit my website. And simply put, I work with professionals to improve pest control through research and education in order to protect our communities and the environment. So I'm an entomologist. I do extension work. I work a lot with pest control. All of my applied research is in the field with pest control collaborators and basically enablers. I couldn't do the work without you guys. I also reach out regularly to assess the needs of pest control in my region so that I can understand the trends and the issues and hopefully design my research and education to address those. And we do that through all kinds of means. We do traditional laboratory research, but primarily we're doing in the field practitioner research, collaborative research. We do a lot of hands-on education, and I do a lot of publication, not in the traditional peer-reviewed academic sense, although we do that as well, but within newsletters, within trade magazines, within venues that you guys see and you guys utilize in language that makes sense to you. So check it out if you're not familiar with my program. So let's jump right in here. You've probably seen this acronym, IPM, Integrated Pest Management. And maybe you have wondered, where did this all come from? It's all rooted in agriculture. And the history actually goes right back to where I'm sitting in the San Francisco Bay Area. There was a group of biological control researchers at UC Berkeley who developed a concept called integrated control. And this article I'm showing here, which was published in 1959, is usually cited as the beginning of this concept. So you'll see that the article title is The Integration of Chemical and Biological Control of the Spotted Alfalfa Aphid. And then you see the subtitle, The Integrated Control Concept. So they used a special case of this one insect pest to introduce this concept to the world. And simply put, they sought to use chemical control, pesticides, in combination with biological control. And in this case, they're talking about parasites and predators of aphids that were already present in the field, and use those control methods in a way that they did not interfere with one another. So in other words, if the chemical control kills your biological control, you do not have integration. And so this was a brand new concept. Even though people knew that they had beneficial parasites and predators out there in the field, they didn't always look for them, and they didn't always protect those entities when they were making their chemical applications. So this is the first time, 1959, that this I word is used, integrated control. And, they also introduced a concept here that was entirely based on economics. And the idea, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but there are pest populations that are out there all the time fluctuating. And if they fluctuate and grow to a certain point, they will cause what's called economic injury. So that's, if you're in agriculture, that means you're losing your crop, you're losing money. And so the IPM concept, or the integrated control concept, is we don't do anything until we're about to lose money. So we understand that these pests are present. There are natural enemies that are taking care of their population. But if they escape that natural control, we have to do something about it or we will lose money. So it was entirely based on economics. Now, IPM is more holistic these days than just economics. So there are other significant events in agricultural IPM history that we need to discuss. I mentioned biological control. There's a long history of biological control. In 1889, we had the first successful program of biological control, and this is classical biocontrol, where we have a pest. In this case, it was cottony cushion scale in citrus in Southern California that was out of control. This was an exotic pest from a different place, a different country. We actually sent entomologists back to the country of origin, Australia, and imported a predator and a parasite. And once we established those in California, we were able to reduce the pressure of that pest. So it was the first time that was ever demonstrated. In the late 1800s, we already were seeing laws to protect our pollinators from pesticides. We still have those kinds of laws and regulations coming at us. And, you know, pollinators are insects. If we're applying insecticides, we have to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with this ecological service provided by the pollinators. 1925, some European countries were banning fruit imports from United States. We were using arsenic compounds for pesticides. And so we still have this concept out there. What's on our food? You know, how can we reduce those residues? 1939, a magical chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticide, DDT, was introduced. Very, very effective, very widely used. But look, it was only 8 years later that we first documented pesticide resistance to that compound. And this is the housefly, which you know has a very quick generational time. So we had this magical pesticide that we started using, but we realized that, you know, if we overuse this thing, the pests become resistant. So this is another driver for more of a holistic model. Then, of course, 1962, the book Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson. If you guys haven't read it, you should. It's very well written. And what this did was it opened the eyes of the general public to some of the negative impacts associated with widespread pesticide use. And really, we're talking about environmental impacts. So this book and really the public knowledge that followed it led to the formation of the US EPA in 1970. And today the US EPA registers all of our pesticides that we use both in agriculture and in pest control. And, you know, this might have been the best thing that President Nixon ever did, right? It's good that we have some kind of eye on these materials that we're using because, hey, they're designed to kill. So we need to make sure that we are limiting and really minimizing those negative impacts that we may have on the environment and on the general public, on people. The full expression integrated pest management did not occur in the press until 1972. And here's how it was defined, and this was by a governmental council. It's an approach that employs a combination of techniques to control the wide variety of potential pests that may threaten crops. So here we're still talking about agriculture. It involves maximum reliance on natural pest population controls. So that's talking about the predators and parasites, along with a combination of techniques that may contribute to suppression, cultural methods, pest-specific diseases, resistant crops, sterile insects, attractants, augmentation of those parasites and predators that are out there, or chemical pesticides as needed. So IPM does include the use of pesticides as needed. That is still true today. So don't let anyone tell you that pesticides are not part of IPM. Now, I was taught agricultural IPM in this way at UC Davis. I was taught by Professor Lester Ayler, who himself was a student of those UC Berkeley biocontrol researchers. And so I like to think that I was taught, from the progenitors of IPM. It's a decision-making process that helps us manage pests below the unacceptable levels while minimizing negative impacts. It starts with education, proper identification, then prevention. If we can prevent pests from becoming a problem, we will never have to treat them. Monitoring. How do we know the pest is present or absent? How do we know if populations are increasing or decreasing? And you'll understand that monitoring is super important for the next step, which is thresholds. How do we know when to take action? And this is super important in agriculture because there are natural enemies, like in this central photo here, the ladybird beetle larva eating the aphids. So we know that these critters are out there. When do we decide they're not doing the job and we actually need to step in with a pesticide? We won't know that if we're not monitoring the population somehow. In classical IPM, when we take action, we use multiple tactics. You can't integrate one tactic. So there have to be at least two different tactics that are being used. And traditionally, this was chemical and biological, but there are all kinds of other, cultural and physical controls that can be used. They are used in a way that they do not interfere with one another. That's the integration. And then finally, we're evaluating this program such that we learn from what we did, what worked, what didn't work. And again, the idea is that we are taking action before we have a problem. All right. So if we're monitoring, we can see that this red line here, which represents the pest population, is increasing. And if we let it get to this dark blue line, which is the economic injury level, we're going to lose money. So a concept called the economic threshold was developed. And so we have to do something when we reach this threshold to prevent the population from reaching the economic injury level. And so the benefit here outweighs the cost. That's the idea. So what about IPM for urban pests? So our urban pests are not threatening agriculture, and agriculture is about feeding people, it's about making money. And so you can understand why IPM was an economic concept for agriculture. Pest management was kind of a production cost, a cost of doing business. But in urban systems, we're trying to protect public health. We're trying to protect structures, which of course are economic assets. And then sometimes we're serving our customers who don't want ants in their home or ants crawling up into their trucks when there's a flood. All right. So this is a nuisance situation. So how do we apply the principles of IPM to these urban pests? I use this very simple definition, which is really adapted from the agricultural IPM definition. IPM is a process used to keep pests below unacceptable levels while minimizing risks to people and the environment. So I highlighted two things here: unacceptable levels and minimizing risks. Unacceptable levels is somewhat subjective. It may be determined by your customer. If it's public health, An unacceptable level may be 1, all right? So that means the thresholds within urban IPM are usually much, much lower than the thresholds considered in agricultural IPM. The other thing highlighted here is minimizing risks. There are all kinds of risks associated with pest management, but we have to also consider the risks posed by the pests. And so I use that concept to create what I call the IPM action equation. We take action when the risk of the pest outweighs the risk of pest management. And so every time we're making an application or a treatment, this should be true. If we do nothing, the risk of that pest outweighs any potential risk of the pest management. The problem here is it's very difficult to balance this equation. There's not a common denominator, all right? So sometimes we can put an economic value on the risk of the pest, but other times we can't. How do you put value on public health or environmental health? And the same goes for the other side of the equation. Even if we think we fully understand the risks of the pest management actions, how do we put a value on those risks? And so this equation is very sticky. It's theoretical. And we'll have some people who tend to weigh the risk of the pest more than pest management and the other way around. And I'm sure that you've met people who are very concerned about the risk of the pest management tactics, but aren't aware or really valuing of the risk of the pest itself. So there are some researchers in the urban pest control world that are trying to address this equation. So my colleague Bernard Lewis and his colleague at UC Berkeley, who's an economist, David Zilberman, have published just this year an economic assessment of drywood termites in California and the use of sulfurofluoride for whole structure fumigation. From an economic standpoint, it's a fascinating read. You can check it out in the Journal of Economic Entomology. So I think that more of IPM researchers really need to start looking at this. How do we balance that equation and show that the risk of the pest does outweigh the risk of the pest management? So the central tenets of urban IPM are exactly the same as the central tenets of agricultural IPM. There may be some differences. For instance, the thresholds may be much lower, but the process is the same. We have to learn about the pest. All right, so this Turkestan cockroach in the photo, this is an outdoor species. When you find it indoors, it's because it got in somehow, didn't live or breed in there. Prevention. You see this exclusion for rodents. This is excellent. This is a preventive tactic that professionals can provide as a service. Monitoring. Anytime you're working with glue boards, pheromone traps, you are providing a professional service. It's not a treatment, but it's monitoring. You are there to detect a problem before it gets out of hand. Once we do reach the threshold in urban IPM, I would argue that we also use multiple tactics. We have all kinds of ways to use non-chemical as well as effective chemical tactics in urban pest management, and we integrate those. And hopefully, if you're keeping records, you're learning from your program, so you're evaluating your program. And in this way, that feeds back into education. And so it's a never-ending cycle. That's why we call it management and not control. All right. Control is kind of putting out a fire. It's a one-time problem that you've solved. Management never ends, and we're always learning and improving. If you'd like to read a history of urban pest control, there's a great article that I found in PCT written by Professor Jerome Goddard. And He goes all the way back to ancient civilizations and the rat catchers of Western Europe. And at the end, he writes, pesticides are used sparingly, he's talking about now, or in conjunction with other non-chemical control methods, a familiar term called integrated pest management. So we are doing this in urban pest control already. My friend and colleague Nick Grisafi with Syngenta just posted a week ago in LinkedIn about something said in the 1930s by Hugo Hartnack, one of the fathers of urban pest control in the United States, that the new pest controller needs to work with city planners to design pest-free cities. Guess what that is? That's prevention. That's part of IPM. In 1945, Arnold Mallis, and so that's one of the structural pest control Bible authors, the Mallis Guide, he emphasized the need for an IPM approach to structural pest control. The question Nick asks is, now we have the California Department of Pesticide Regulation using a new term called sustainable pest management, and it includes both agriculture and urban settings. So he's asking, what's going to change? We've been talking about this for a long time. We still have issues with our structures and infrastructures. So sustainable pest management, if you read about it, it is IPM. It talks about a holistic view within pest management, considering the environment and considering human health. And they've introduced a new concept of social equity. I would argue this is still IPM, just with a different brand. So what about this term, assessment-based pest management? So my friend Deanie Miller has published just a few years ago a series of articles where she used assessments of German cockroach populations to decide how much gel bait to apply and where to apply it. That's IPM under a different name. And she makes a good argument about why IPM is not fully understood or utilized in urban systems. And perhaps we do need a new brand. But what she's introducing to us is IPM under a different name. So assessment-based pest management is IPM. It includes monitoring. It includes targeted applications based on population sizes, which requires monitoring. All right, so let's go through these central tenets of urban IPM with some examples. So let's start with education. And a big part of education is proper identification. We need to understand the ecology of our target. And in order to do that, we need to properly identify our target. So here's a case of small flies. A lot of you guys deal with flies in structures, restaurants, schools. And if all you do is think about the fly, you need to identify that fly. And the reason is because fly management requires identification of the larval habitat. If you are trying to target the adult flies, you will never get control because you have a source of larvae that are developing, and some adults that escape your control measures will lay eggs in those habitats. And so you have a source and you have hundreds more eggs being laid. And so in order to locate the larval habitat, you have to identify the fly. So if you just think that all small flies are quote unquote fruit flies, you're going to be missing the boat. So on the left, you do have what people commonly call a fruit fly, more properly known as a vinegar fly. And these may be developing as larvae on overripe fruits and vegetables. On the right, you actually have a phorid fly or humpback or scuttle fly. And these insects, as larvae, develop in decaying organic matter, usually of a proteinaceous source. So they may be developing in old garbage, old meat, feces, that kind of thing. And so you're going to be looking for very different habitats if you're managing these different fly species. And you can make this identification In this case, by looking at wing venation, there's some heavily sclerotized or really darkened veins on the wing of the forward fly. Forward fly also has an enlarged and flattened hind femur. So if you didn't make this identification, you could be targeting the totally wrong area within your structure. And this is IPM. This becomes even more difficult when you have members of the same family in different habitats. So here we have two species of Drosophila. On the left, you've got your vinegar fly, but on the right, we call these the dark-eyed fruit flies or dark-eyed vinegar flies. These dark-eyed fruit flies actually breed in drains and organic matter that's accumulated underneath floor tiles and bathrooms. So they're not going to be found in the overripe fruit, even though they're from the exact same family. And so we have to learn how to identify these things in order to target the larval habitat and have success. Now, sometimes this is more difficult. So this is a termite species I work with here in California that we don't even know what species we may be working with. This is a species complex because we have some populations that swarm in the fall and some populations that swarm in the spring. So recent research has actually highlighted that we may have 5 species of Reticulotermes in California. And this is important because when we do testing of new pest control tactics or materials, we need to make sure that we're testing on the correct species. If you're a pest control operator, you need to know what time of the year do these subterranean termites swarm in your area so you can increase your monitoring efforts or perhaps your outreach efforts to your customers. So identification is not always easy, but it's very, very important from an IPM standpoint. What about prevention? We talked a lot about exclusion. What about prevention of introduction? So you guys may work a lot with bed bugs and multi-unit housing. Very complex situation where you've got close quarters, you've got shared walls and shared resources. You have people that don't report their infestations. And so quickly a bed bug problem can become a community-wide problem. How do we prevent introduction in the first place? It comes down to education. Maybe we're educating the residents, or we may be educating the management and staff at these sites, but there are certain things people can do. They can take precautions when they're traveling. A big one is secondhand furniture. So if you're low income and you see a valuable piece of furniture or maybe mattress or bed a box spring out on the street, hey, that saves you money, but you may be bringing in a ready-made infestation, and people may not realize that at all. So just a little bit of simple communication and education with these groups can help to prevent the introduction of this serious pest. What about monitoring and thresholds? So we know that monitoring is super important, but what about thresholds? In urban systems, the thresholds may be very, very low. So we talked about bed bugs or German cockroaches or rodents. The threshold in those cases is 1 individual. So 1 rat, you got to do something. 1 bed bug, better do something. But there are other systems where the thresholds are higher. So here's an example. Yellowjacket wasps. These are native insects, all right? They are predators. They prey on caterpillars. They prey on spiders, other soft-bodied arthropods. They are pollinators. But guess what? When the populations get too high, especially around parks, picnic areas, schools, swimming pools, they sting people. They're attracted to human food. They sting people. I've been involved for the past couple years in a research project that's developing some baiting materials to control yellow jackets, but we need to know when there's a problem. And so we use monitoring devices In this case, we're using monitoring devices that have a food odor, heptylbutyrate, smells like ripe pears, and we're catching yellow jackets, but we're also counting and determining how many wasps per day per trap are we catching. And over the years, we have determined that this threshold of 10 wasps per day means that we're going to be having problems with stings. If we're catching less than that, less than 10 per day, we don't take action. But if we're managing, let's say, a park or a school, and we're up at that threshold of 10 per day, we try to find the nests so that we can remove these yellow jackets before people start getting stung. Multiple tactics and integration. This is probably my favorite part of IPM because I love learning about all the different tools that we have out there and how they work together. So a great story on this one is Turkestan and Oriental cockroaches in California. I understand, of course, these cockroaches are common throughout the southern and western United States. So listen up. These are peridomestic species. That means they do not live and breed inside. The Turkestans actually are very common in these expansion joints or void spaces under pavement. You may find them in water meter boxes, utility boxes, and they're living and breeding out there. And then at night, they're foraging. So if you have a huge gap under your exterior doors, this is at a public school, they're going to get in. All right. I caught this one in the act. And of course, that leads to unnecessary interior pesticide application. So we can actually use structural exclusion to solve this problem. The school district that I was working with, they used some temporary solutions like this expanding foam to try to close gaps. Uh, I would say more permanent solutions like the door sweeps and door brushes to seal the gaps. But then this was really cool. They actually found the rotted out expansion joints or cold joints in their hardscape and sealed them with proper sealants and mortar. And this removes the hiding place, the breeding place for these cockroaches and reduced the population non-chemically. They also raised all of their trash cans off the ground with these metal pedestals, making it harder for the cockroaches to access those resources. So these are all preventive, but also non-chemical tactics. In addition, here's the multiple tactics side of it. We used a bait-only program to reduce a humongous population at one of these school districts. So we used gel baits, and we did something experimental. We used rodent stations that are lock and key and affixed to the hardscape. We could put gel bait inside there. Cockroaches would walk right in. They don't care, it's made for mice. We also would fill PVC slip couplings with gel, and you could drop those down into these utility boxes. And so by using this combination of tactics, exclusion, prevention, and chemical tactics, we were able to reduce a massive Turkestan cockroach population at a public school. We were helped in part by the cannibalism of these cockroaches, so this is a male Turkestan cockroach that was stuck on the edge of a glue board, and his buddies ate him alive. Now, if he had some bait inside his body, then that bait imparts secondary mortality to his buddies that cannibalized him. And that's one of the reasons why baits work so well for cockroaches, is because they cannibalize each other. Okay, so integration. What is integration? We talked about using multiple tactics, but we want to make sure that they're working together. So those tactics come together to make a whole, to make up your whole program. And they do it in a way that they do not interfere with one another. So think about baiting for German cockroaches. If you have poor sanitation at that site, your bait deposits may not be that attractive. And so here, this is an example of a cultural control and a chemical control that are used in a way that produce a whole which is more successful. But, classic integration from an agricultural standpoint is about integrating chemical and biological. And you may say, well, in urban systems, we don't have a lot of biological control agents. That's generally true, but in our outdoor systems, we may. So this video here shows an egg parasitoid of large cockroaches. This one will get Oriental cockroaches, American cockroaches, Turkestan cockroaches. And what it does is it lays its egg in the ootheca. That's the egg case of the cockroach. One egg hatches into a little wasp larva. That larva eats all of the eggs in the ootheca, or the egg packet. And so if we're using broad spectrum insecticides like, say, a pyrethroid spray, we're going to kill those wasps in addition to the cockroaches. If we're using gel or another bait, those baits only affect insects that eat them, all right, or touch them in some cases. So you could argue that we're integrating the egg parasitoid with our chemical if we're using bait, because the bait should not affect that wasp at all. It doesn't affect the eggs of the cockroach. So the wasp eats the eggs, and then anything that survives the wasp, we kill with our bait. So that is true integration in a classical sense. When we use pesticides, we manage risk. Pesticides are absolutely a valuable part of an IPM program when they're warranted, but we can look to minimize the risk associated with those materials. So on your products, you have a signal word. Now that's an EPA connotation of acute hazard. How dangerous is this thing to mixers, handlers, applicators, bystanders? And it's important information. We can also consider biopesticides. The only one I know of that's in widespread use or increasing use in the United States is apprehend. It's actually an entomopathogenic fungus that we use against bed bugs. The fungus penetrates the cuticle, kills the insect, and then actually can sporulate and attack additional insects. So we're actually applying a live fungus to these bed bug infestations. I don't know if there are professional products, but there are nematodes. There are nematode products out there that are labeled for flea larvae. So if you know where the flea larvae are developing, this is a very effective application. And again, I don't know if there are professional products with these nematodes, microscopic worms that seek out the flea larvae and parasitize and kill them. We can also manage risk by reducing pesticide exposure. So think about baits. We talked about cockroach baits. We have ant baits. We have termite baits. These reduce risk to people, pets, and the environment because the only way that they leave the application site is within the target insect's body. All right, so it's a great way to reduce risk. What about water-soluble dose packets? So I'm showing you here an FMC product, Transport GHP. This comes in these water-soluble dose packets that reduce the chance for exposure to a handler, a mixer, an applicator. So as compared to, let's say, a liquid concentrate that you have to mix with water, this really reduces the chance for splash or spill during mixing. So it's another way to manage risk when we're using pesticides. Finally, with pesticides, we have to consider pesticide resistance. This is part of IPM, managing resistance. The idea is that if we're using the same chemical over and over, or the same class of chemical, we are selecting for resistant individuals. And over time, we will not have any susceptible individuals in the population. And this has already happened with bed bugs, German cockroaches, and other insects that are out there, such that our conventional tools no longer work. And so we can avoid this problem by rotating chemical classes, but also by using non-chemical tactics. So think about bed bugs. They're not resistant to vacuums or heat. They can't. They can't survive vacuum or heat. So that's a great way to deal with a resistant population, is with a non-chemical tactic. Finally, we've got evaluation within IPM. Here's an example where my colleagues and I sought to evaluate an IPM program for bed bugs. What is an IPM program for bed bugs? Well, we had extensive education of managers and tenants at these multi-unit sites. We had use of preventive tactics. We used property-wide regular monitoring. So that means we did not wait for people to complain they had bed bugs. We actually monitored in every single unit in a multi-unit building. When we found bed bugs, we used a combination of non-chemical and chemical tactics. So here's what that looks like. Here's an educational program during the pandemic. Everybody's got masks on in the lobby. In some cases, we use canines in every single unit, whether there was a report of bed bugs or not. We used heat, in this case, electric heat. We used desiccants, and in some cases, we did use liquid insecticides when the population warranted that tactic. And so we found that not only could we reduce bedbug density over a 1-year program, but we also saved money. So the costs associated with the IPM program, even though we were visiting every single unit, decreased the annual cost of the program. And that's really due to all the prevention that we provided and the early detection associated with that proactive whole property monitoring program. So I'm wrapping up, but I wanted to show you guys a newsletter that UCIPM produces. It's called the Green Bulletin, and it's free. You can get it in your email inbox. And for instance, 2 of the stories I shared today are highlighted in detail. Proactive IPM and bait only for Turkestan cockroaches. So sign up, check it out. We've got all kinds of cool stuff in this newsletter, and it is serving your industry. If you'd like to support my program, you can purchase a cockroaches poster. I've got it up in the wall on the wall behind me. It's $15. I know Luigi's on here. I owe him a poster. I'm sorry. I'll get it to you. But anyway, this helps support my program and goes right into my research and supplies budget. So that's what I've got for you guys. Thank you very much.
Great presentation, Andrew. Thank you very much.